It. Good morning, everybody. There are a couple of things to note about this presentation. One, this is our one and only slide, so we're not going to be death by PowerPoint. And two, this is supposed to feel like a discussion rather than us presenting at you. So when there's time, you can text your questions in, and we're going to have a great time in this 50 minutes that we have. I'm Darnell Pierce. I work for Dorm Room Movers, and I've worked in the res life and housing space for a number of years, and I've now transitioned to the other side. But I like to remain connected, and so today we're talking about leading from the inside out and unpacking, get it, because we do storage and shipping and packing, unpacking the RA selection process, something that I did when I was in res life and housing. Loved that process, but I think we have some flaws in the way that we find talents. That's the way I think about how we find quality young people to help run our campuses. And I am of the thought that if you have the best RA staff, you will have a great res life department. Because as you all know, they are the people who are eyes on the ground, boots on the ground. They're seeing everything for us. And so how you do selection really matters. And a lot of this comes from my own personal experience of going through selection process, going through professional processes, and haven't been brought up, prepared for that type of a setup. And so I'll talk about what that means. So raise your hand if you have some sort of a one-on-one or two-on-one interview process during your RA selection process. Got it. Hands down. Raise your hand if you have mostly called group process or group activity for your RA selection process. Okay. Raise your hand if you have a process designed so that your returning RAs reapply in some form or fashion. Got it. Raise your hand if you as professional staff, if you reapply for your job every year. Oop. Okay, so that's one of the things. When I became a director at Bard College, we had a process where RA staff had to reapply for their job every year, and I haven't been a fan of that ever, and I'll talk about why. But first, I'll go back to our selection process and what we're doing. So the RA selection process, in my opinion, is designed to cultivate talent, not find talent. It is designed to cultivate talent, not find talent. And what that means is we have young people coming from all over the world, all over the country, to our campuses, and they're not coming from the same playing field. So that means if I was a student who went to a school where I was prepped and propped and I can come in and do your process, I'm gonna do great. And sometimes unintentionally we look for those types of students. They've been proctors at boarding schools, they've been in student leadership positions. They know the game, so to speak, right? And so they can do well in our current process. They can do well in the group process. They're going to be raising their hand, and they know the things to say. They can do an interview. Maybe they have parents or aunts and uncles who've taught them how to get through an interview process. But a lot of us, like me, I didn't have that experience. And so I didn't necessarily know how to interview, but I had an unbeatable work ethic. And so how do you design a process that can sift through maybe just someone just doesn't know how to interview, but they're going to be a damn good RA or a damn good student leader. And so right now I think the way our current process is, I think we're missing some of those awesome students. And we'll talk about ways that I've done that in the past, and it is a longer process. And so when I talk about cultivating talent versus finding talent, when we find talent, we're talking about finding someone who's already packaged and ready to go. Most of our students aren't packaged and ready to go to do the job. So that 4 years or 3 years at our campus, it is our job to cultivate their talent and bring out their natural skill sets that they have. I learned how to interview through the process, through like trial and error, right? Because that's just the way the world is designed, that you have to go to these interviews and say the right things and do the things. And so, but what we really want is for finding people that belong in our organizations. How many people know Brene Brown? Love her, great. and she talks about fitting in versus belonging. Has anyone seen that quote, that clip about fitting in? This idea of, and we say this, oh, they're a great fit or they're not a great fit. And she reframed it by saying, fitting in, that could work, but it requires you to change who you are, to adapt, to fit in to a certain organization, to fit into that department, to fit into what that culture has become. Versus belonging, it demands me to be who I am. I'm coming to the table fully authentically me, and then I'm incorporated into that community. I don't have to change who I am. I can develop who I am. I can be cultivated to bring out my natural skill sets, and then I could potentially be a great asset to your team, whether it's an RA, resident, and this expands to be even being a resident director, assistant director, that we're cultivating talent. So in your one-on-one interviews, what are you all, and this is where you can answer, what are you all looking for when you are one-on-one interviewing a young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed 18, 19-year-old? What are you looking for?
So typically, I look for, are they trainable? And the questions are very, now I have a little bit of an HR background. So the questions are very much geared towards, is this something, they may not know the right answer, but can they get through the process?
Right. And so sometimes that can come out in how we design our questions versus, how are they thinking about this answer, whether it is, if it's the right answer or not. I'm more concerned about what their thought, how they got to that answer, even if it's something like, that's definitely not the right answer, but how they got there, to me, makes all the difference. I remember, I'll tell a quick story because I think storytelling is really powerful. So I remember when I first applied to be an area coordinator, I was switching from the health and fitness industry because that was my goal. I was going to be an athletic director at a college campus or manage a big lofty gym. And so I was interviewing just to try and get back onto a campus. I was an RA, so that was my experience to get in. And when I interviewed, I didn't know this at the time, but I knew it now, having been in the field. There was no way I was saying the right things. There was no way I wasn't saying the things that candidates for RD or AC typically say. Once I moved through the ranks, I'm like, oh yeah, that was bad. But the person who interviewed me, she saw something in me. She gave me an opportunity. She saw my work ethic, and I talked about that. And so that's been my journey. So whenever I've hired resident directors or area coordinators or assistant directors, it is always, because it's part of my story, right? It's always important to me to have a few non-traditional candidates. And it's not that I'm going to necessarily hire them, but I'm giving them the opportunity because somebody gave me that opportunity. So of course it depends on what your current staff is made up of. Of course it depends on what you need at the time. But I would encourage you, especially when you're hiring RAs, find the unexpected talent that you have on your campus. The person who's been through the conduct system, they have been some of my greatest hires. I've been afforded to work at BARD. They have the largest prison initiative in the country, and so what that means is inmates, they get a actual BARD degree. They're going through the same curriculum as BARD students. And one of the things that we talk about is like, a mistake shouldn't bar you from getting an education. So when we talk about hiring people, we hire people through the conduct. We removed from our process that if you had 1 or 2 or 3 violations that you couldn't be an RA. And some of those students became our best staff members because they've been able to make the mistakes. We didn't judge them. We didn't say, he got caught drinking alcohol 2 or 3 times, so now you can't be an RA. They're probably best poised to be an RA, in my opinion. So that's one. So find ways to find those unpolished, if you will, people who can work on your campus as an RA. 2, find ways to incorporate in your process that maybe you're adding to or detracting from it, some way that they can present something that they're passionate about. We incorporated in our process. It was not in place a group process, but they had to, any topic they wanted, they chose a topic, they had 20 minutes to present on something they were passionate about. And what we were looking for is, how do they impart knowledge on us? And the presentations that they came up with, we didn't give them any format. We didn't say it had to be a PowerPoint, but though they were so whimsical and thoughtful, and we had people who normally didn't apply because we didn't have this traditional group process where you had to be in a group and figure out a problem, that sort of thing. Those work fine. I've done those many a times, but I think by changing that and allowing them to show up and present themselves authentically, we got a better turnout. We drastically changed how we did one-on-one interviews. Our questions were very different, and it was, again, to pull out how you think about the work that we do, how you think about campus. We took out, how many of you require your RAs to get a reference, write a resume, and a cover letter to apply to be an RA? Yep, we did. So we took it out. Let me rephrase that. We kept it in, but it was not a decision-making factor in our process, and here's why. That is purely a learning mechanism. We want you to practice so that when you go into the working world, you have some knowledge, but it wasn't a decision-making factor. They're all coming in with the similar same. There is no student, I'm like, yep, they got the experience, they don't. They all have similar types of experiences. So it wasn't a decision-making factor for us, but it was a learning moment that we can use to help cultivate their experience in applying for jobs, doing that from the start, so that when they graduate, they're like, yeah, I've done this, I got this, I know what it should look like. There are too many RAs that they get done and they don't know how to market themselves when they're getting their first job. You come packaged with all this knowledge, and if you are leaving our institution and you don't know how to put together a sound resume and cover letter, then we have failed you. And so don't let that happen. So what I would say is take that out of the decision-making process. It can be a part of the application process, but don't let that be a decision maker. That should be a teachable moment of like, this was trash. Well, I don't say that unless I have a particular relationship with a student. Some students you can say that this is a hot mess. Others, it depends on your relationship, but use that as a teachable moment. I want to check time. This 50 minutes, we're going fast. I'm going to share one more story about a student who applied to be an RA. I'm trying to think of which one I want to do. So this student applied. No, I'm going to do a professional staff person who applied to be an area coordinator. And on paper, right, this person had the things, it had some of the things, and there were other candidates who, it just looked great. So we decided to interview this one candidate who at face value wouldn't have got through many search processes, but I decided to interview him. Went through the process and interviewed him, and instantly I'm like, oh, he knows it. He got it. It was between him and two other candidates. And so I ended up calling him back. This was not a part of our process. So I called him back and I said, what is it about Bard, and do you really want to be here? And he was like, he told me the things that he really wanted to be there. I said, okay, got it. And so he came there and he worked circles around every area coordinator on our campus. When I say worked circles, and I think partly because now he has something to prove, and that connected with my story. When I came in, I knew I was the underdog. I didn't come from a traditional background. I didn't have the graduate assistantship. I didn't have any of that. So when I got on that campus, I said, oh, I got this. I'm about to work these people. And he did that same thing because he was given an opportunity. And sometimes you don't give the diamond in the rough an opportunity. So I would say when you're interviewing, especially young people or entry-level staff, find the people who you typically would not move through your process. Just give them an opportunity. Doesn't mean you got to hire them. You might be surprised. I've been a diamond in the rough for a very long time in the field of higher ed, and I've worked through the processes, And so it's become a part of my mission to do that whenever I hire people. When I'm hiring people for our company, we just went through our hiring process, and same thing, finding talent that you wouldn't typically look for, and sometimes people will surprise you. Can anybody else relate to this?
I got something to say.
Oh, you can, okay. There you go, sir.
Hello, my name's Dennis Gable. I also work for Dorm Room Movers. I'm the marketing manager, and my story is wild. The idea of fitting in versus belonging is something that is extremely powerful to consider. By a show of hands, how many of you believe that you get to authentically live out the life that you are choosing to live? A couple of us. Yeah, shit sucks. Most of us get to walk through life only hoping to be seen, only hoping to have our voices heard, only hoping that somebody will give us a chance to do something we're really actually great at. And then we grow up, and we find ourselves in jobs and careers with opportunities, bills, kids, breakups, mortgages, and all of that hope and piss and vinegar that we had when we were young lays to rest under a headstone that said, "This should have been." And we don't really find ourselves after that. I think the role that you hold, and mind you, I never really went to college. I did 2 years at an art school when I was 32. That's the bulk of my education. I'm traditionally uneducated. I didn't really learn how to use a comma until I was 26 years old, and it was because my friends just kept making fun of me. When I say that I'm not traditionally educated, I didn't do well in the system. I'm loud. I'm a bit overwhelming. Most people have told me that I'm too much most of my life. So the traditional education system didn't serve me. And so the idea of college showed up, and I was like, I'll go to community college. That lasted 2 whole weeks. I dropped out, and I was a musician for a handful of years and tried my very best to pave a life that I wanted to create. But being unheard and unseen is a gigantic part of my story. And so with my experience not being in your shoes and not even ever living in a dorm or being a part of residential life or having the college experience, what I can tell you is what Darnell said earlier, the opportunity to give a kid who may not look like the right kid on paper a chance could change their entire life. This is not just about your job and your role in your campus. This is about your opportunity to truly be leaders and lead young people into a life that they weren't going to have if you didn't give them a shot. And so there's a heavy burden that we bear when we think about who humans are. Who are these young people? Why does this young 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old kid act like such a jackass all the time? Why? Most of us, even the most rebellious of us, I speak from that club. I think I'm one of the leaders of the club, to be fair. We're just doing the best we can with what we've been given to work with. And sometimes we're doing the best we can with what we're creating and cultivating out of our own story. And the thing that is the most challenging for you is that you don't get to know those details most of the time. Mm-hmm. You don't know the home life of these young men and women. You don't know the home life of the kids coming into your campus just wanting to change the story that was written for them. I'm very grateful to be a part of a parenting generation where parents actually seem to give a real shit. My child will not have the experience that I had. That is for sure. However, people didn't ask me why I was the way I was. And what I never got to explain was that my dad was a heroin addict, And my mom took as much speed as she could get, like she was on a racetrack. I grew up in bars. I grew up around adults who didn't have the respect for me or themselves to give me a solid idea of what to become. I'm the product of divorce. I'm the product of abandonment. When I was 11 years old, as a quick story, my mom thought that it was more important to go to the bar and party than to actually come home and take care of her child. So I'm really good at cooking macaroni and cheese, in case anybody's curious. But that was months of seeing my mom just in the morning, where she would go out after work, I would come home, I would make myself dinner, put myself to sleep, and she would be able to do enough drugs to get up and go to work the next day and then do it over and over and over. Nobody was asking me why I couldn't keep myself together. Nobody was asking me, Dennis, why do you want all of the attention? Because inside of myself I was screaming, nobody sees me! And so I acted like a fool. So if you were to put how I behaved versus who I've become, my story would make zero sense to you. And I'm grateful for an opportunity to share a small part of my story with a group of humans that I never even got to interact with. I never even got to interact with humans like you. In places of leadership, at a college or university, where people are pursuing education. And so what I hope that you take from this little bit of my story is an opportunity to ask a kid why. You see leadership traits in these young people, regardless of what their resume says, regardless of how well written their cover letter was, regardless of whether they were privileged enough to go to a school that fed them into your college or university, or whether they were privileged enough to have parents who could afford certain things that they get to do. There's going to be a kid that you look into their eyes and you see who they are. Holding back tears, pause. Don't let that human go. Please. The difference that you can make by seeing somebody and allowing them to belong versus forcing them to fit in will not only be a saving grace for who they become as an adult, potentially, but I would challenge you that it will also heal the parts of you that you've been screaming to want to be seen. One of the most impactful things about being a parent for me is that I get to see the young version of me in my wild-ass 10-year-old son. And everything that I tell him, knock that shit off, stop doing that, be quiet, don't, is me yelling at my young self. Because for so many years I was told to shut up and sit down and stop dancing and stop trying to be funny and stop and stop and stop. And so I just had this built-in mechanism to go, bro, knock it off. And the more that I was willing to see myself in my son, the less I've been willing to do that. And the more I'm able to say, act like an idiot. It's okay. Scream, yell, be loud. It's fine. Everybody will live. Whether you have children or don't, you hold a role where you can heal a part of your child self, which heals a part of our adult self. The only way that we get to choose who we become in this life is to step into it. And the more that we try to fit in versus being willing to accept our belonging, the harder it becomes. And the older we get, the more grumpy we get about it, let me tell you. Because it's job after job and person after person and friend after friend and relationship after relationship of just all of us being the 9-year-old version of ourselves saying, will somebody please just see me for what I am? I'm grateful for the life that I've been willing to cultivate. Willing is the correct word. I learned this skill when I was 17 years old. I had a teacher, I took a public speaking class because I was like, this is going to be easy, I talk a lot. And my public speaking teacher put me to the test. because he looked in my eyes and he saw what I knew, what I didn't know was there. And he pushed me, and it pissed me off, and I hated him so bad during that class. I've been able to speak in front of literally hundreds of thousands of people over the course of my life. I'm surprisingly articulate for being an uneducated kid who comes from West Phoenix, who didn't have the attention, who found himself in detention more than he found himself on any sort of honor roll, that's for damn sure. I graduated high school with a 2.4 GPA. Those don't get you into college, just in case you're curious. Everything that I've been willing to learn is because I've had certain people in my life look me in the eyes and see that part of me that nobody else was willing to see. The primary person to ever do that, though, was myself. Over and over and over. But if I didn't have Mr. Taylor, who was my senior English teacher, put my senior paper down in front of me and said, I hate so much when people do fast but good work. And it had an A-, which pushed my grade to a D so that I could graduate. He knew that there was something that I couldn't share. Be aware of these students. Be aware of these humans. Be aware that it might be you. One of the topics I discuss a lot. If you're ever unfortunate enough to find me on Instagram, you'll see that I talk about this topic quite a bit. Vulnerability and the ability to understand self-knowing are the topics that I talk about a lot. Let me assure you, it is painful as shit to stare yourself in the face. Especially if you've had an upbringing where people just tell you how shitty you are all the time. Pardon my language, it's just part of who I am. I'm actually not sorry. I hope you're all adults. When you have people telling you how shitty you are all the time, you believe it because you don't have a choice. Finding inside of yourself the silver lining, the rose, the piece of gold, the diamond that sits inside of you is a you job. And I would encourage all of you to travel that journey. Just ask yourself very simple questions. Why did I do that dumbass thing? Why was I mean to that person? Why did I not, I'm going to take this back to topic, why did I not select that kid? I really liked that kid. Why did I do that? Why did I make that decision? When I started, I asked how many of us feel like they get to authentically live out their own life. And not very many of us raised our hands. If you allow yourself to start doing that, you'll allow kids, students, they're not children anymore, to do that as well. Take a risk on somebody this year. One. Just take a risk on one. And it might bite you in the ass. But take a risk on one. Look that student in the eyes. See the human inside of them. Give them an opportunity to explain why they didn't make the grade. Why they didn't have the ability to write the resume the correct way. Why they didn't know how to interview. Their answers may shock you. Nobody would have ever guessed, still to this day. People assume that I come from some uppity Brady Bunch ass family. And that is not what I come from. Between my ability to be articulate and the color of my skin, people just assume that privilege was handed to me. And if I told you all of the details of my story, you would understand that privilege is not handed out sometimes. No matter where we come from, no matter what we look like, some of us have to fight to become who we are supposed to be. We have to fight to take hold of that royalty, that beauty, that king or queen, that thing inside of us that sometimes only we know exists. And so give somebody that opportunity, please. 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 We're going to take some time for questions. You've been able to text in questions if there's something like wild that you don't want to raise your hand and ask. I assume most of you are relatively audacious, but in the case that you don't want to raise your hand and ask the question, there's an opportunity for you to text in questions. Chelsea's going to be our moderator. But we would love for you to ask us hard questions. Darnell didn't even get an opportunity to share parts of his personal story, which are beautiful. This is one of the most beautiful humans I've ever known. Not just because he's handsome as shit, but because of his story. The amount of adversity that this man has had to overcome is fucking bananas. And if you get an opportunity to meet and speak with him, you'll learn that. So, I say that to say that like we had a lot of fun being able to do this. Like, we are not two peas in a pod. We're very different humans from very different backgrounds. We have similar outlooks on life. And that's the bond that we carry. We both deeply believe in the value of humans, no matter where you come from or who you are or who you love or what you look like. And so that is the bond that ties us, and the details of our story has been able to do that too. So, everything's on the table. Don't be afraid to ask whatever question you're like, oh man, could I ask that? Should I ask that? Just ask it. And if you're too afraid, text Chelsea and she'll tell us. Are there any questions?